All right. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. We'll do the
Good morning.
copyright disclaimer. Good morning. I'm gonna do the copyright disclaimer. This channel may use some copyrighted materials without specific authorization of the owner, but contents used here falls under the fair use. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act, 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, which we'll be doing a little bit today, scholarship, and research. Definitely. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statutes that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit educational or personal use tips a balance in favor of fair use. So there we go.
All right. Let me take that
Good
down
morning,
and
everybody.
we'll
Good
get
morning,
started.
everybody. Yep. And
All
there's
right.
our
There we
faces.
are.
There's our happy-go-lucky faces here. Good morning, everybody. Nighthawk is MIA today. He's missing in action. He had something to do, so we're taking over the joint. We're the bosses today. All right.
Yes, this might not
So,
be a normal show that you're used to, seeing that me and
well,
Dennis are left to our own. As they say, the mice will play when the cat's away.
yeah. Who knows what we may end up with here? You never know. Um, wouldn't it be freaky though if we increase the subscriptions and all that for this? He would never let us live that down. But
So
anyway,
go ahead and tell them what we're going to talk about today, Dennis.
today we're going to talk about ghosts of the Old West, the legends and stories and ghosts of the Old West, and some of that stuff. And how you did a little night watch last night, didn't you? A little sky watch, I mean.
Yeah, I tried experimenting with my phone and tablet to see how good my camera would go in, and I could zoom in pretty good, say on one star or something, but it started getting fuzzier the more
Yeah.
I zoomed in on it. But our Psionics night vision camera still does really well, so we got some footage of it. We just let it roll for a couple hours, so we got to go through it today, and we're probably going to start posting that up on Midwest Night Watchers again on the YouTube channel.
Yeah. Well, it's incredibly hard to take pictures and video of the sky. You got to really be careful how you do it.
So we saw a few objects, going in and out of the Big Dipper, and there was another one that we got to check out. We don't know if it was a satellite or not that we saw zipping across, but
Hmm. Well, like I say, you never know. Keep looking up. You never know what you may see. That's the thing about
that's
it.
right.
Um, People don't, like I was telling somebody the other day, people don't look up like they used to. They're looking at their phones or they're messing around with something. They don't look up like they used to. But now, when I was a kid, my big thing was I loved astronomy. Matter of fact, I cut a lot of grass, yards, and did a lot of yard work and made up enough money to buy my first telescope, which was a Kmart brand thing, a focal telescope, which was all I could afford. Well, I was fascinated by what just a little bit I could see with that telescope. I mean, I saw the rings of Saturn and the moons of Mars. It was fascinating to me, and so that got me hooked on sky watching from then on. I always enjoy connecting the dots with the constellations and just seeing things. There's always something to see in the sky, whether it's a comet or it's a meteor storm or whatever. It's something always interesting. I'll never will forget how neat it was the first time I ever saw a meteor shower. You know, uh, it's fascinating stuff. But there's other stuff up there too that we don't know about. There's some other really bizarre stuff going on there. So I advise everybody to keep looking up and keep watching the sky because you never know what you might see.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah, I got a telescope when I was a kid too from my parents, and It's still out. I still have it, although
Mm.
the optics aren't very good compared to what you can get today.
Oh yeah. If we'd had something like that then, we'd have thought we were rich for sure. Yeah. We'd have thought we were on top of the game.
Yeah,
But
I was lucky to get a Kmart telescope.
yeah, it was okay. Kmart telescope. The Focal was the brand. It was pretty good though. I mean, it was a pretty good telescope for the money. And came with its own tripod and the whole works. I still have it. Matter of fact, I still have it. Still works good. Actually, something that old now is made really better than what you make nowadays. Although the optics I'm sure are better. The actual mechanical part of it is made much better than this stuff. Most everything we got is made in China anyway. But well, anyway, we're getting on our subject matter today. I hope have you monitoring the chat or what?
Yeah,
Are we
I'm
getting any
looking at it. I
feedback?
don't know. I don't know how good I'll be at getting people's
Uh,
comments up or anything, but if anybody has any questions, we'll definitely
uh,
answer them.
that's fine. Just make sure they're connecting with us there if they want to ask us anything. But there's a lot of stories and legends of the Old West. One of my favorites, of course, one of my modern day favorites. I love all the John Wayne movies. Like Rio Bravo and Rio Grande and all that. Um, but my favorite modern, of course, modern movie is Tombstone. With Kurt Russell and all that. I'm your Huckleberry kind of thing,
Yeah.
and that's one of my favorites. But there are a lot of people don't realize this that there is a whole lot of paranormal activity associated with the Old West. I've always wanted to go kick around Tombstone because they say it is one of the most haunted areas. I've seen a lot of ghost pictures supposedly taken around there. I know that there's like a mine nearby. I think it's a silver mine or something. They say that on certain nights, if you're at the entrance of this mine, you can listen real close. You can actually hear the pickaxes of the long dead miners still going to it way down in the mine. So you have neat stuff like that about the old west, especially around the ghost towns. And I've been to a ghost town, so I know what they're like. It's a very creepy place. If you want to see something, definitely. And here's most of that, Gerald. I think a lot of that is what I call residual type hauntings, what are known as residual type. It's sort of leftover memories of a place. And there's a lot of sound residual, like I was talking about the pickaxes or maybe the gunshots you hear, uh, that are attributed to no actual physical gun going off at that time, but you can hear them, and they're not really always real close up. It's like they're far off. And if you have to really be paying attention to pick them up. But I've heard a lot of people said that they have actually heard these phantom gunshots in Tombstone, Dodge City, and places like that. Because we got to realize there was a lot of shootouts going on. But here's another thing a lot of people don't know that most town ordinances back in those days prohibited you from carrying a gun in city limits. You were supposed to, when you got to town, turn in your gun with the sheriff until you got ready to leave. Because people were notorious about getting drunk in the saloon and shooting each other. So you had a lot of stuff like that going on in the old west, and no wonder you've got so many ghost stories attributed to it. There was a lot of people getting shot up. I think the very first time that Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, who I may be slightly related to, by the way, family wise, um, the first time they met was in a saloon, and actually Doc Holliday saved Wyatt Earp's life. And they were all drawing guns on him, and he like put a gun on the main guy, and got Wyatt out of it. That's how they became very good friends. We all need friends like that, don't you?
Yeah,
step
absolutely.
in, step in, and take up for us when they need to. But to this day, this is the reason why I've always wanted to go to the Tombstone. They say that Doc Holliday's spirit is seen there sometimes, along with Wyatt Earp. By the way, Wyatt Earp made a big splash in Hollywood. You know, in the very early days of Hollywood. And some of John Ford was real good friends with Wyatt Earp, by the way, the director John Ford, and so was John Wayne. As a matter of fact, John Wayne actually, whose real name is Marion Morrison, by the way, but John
Right.
Wayne actually took his walk and his kind of talking from actually the way Wyatt Earp did. They were real good friends, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I believe John Wayne was one of the pallbearers at Wyatt Earp's funeral, or he was there anyway. Um, and a lot of the old cowboy stars were friends with Wyatt Earp, so he told them how to do it, which is good to have somebody with experience come in and let you know what the real deal was on it. But here's the thing about Wyatt Earp and some of the other guys. They were kind of flaky about where they were at on the side of the law sometimes. Sometimes they used it to their advantage. Sometimes they didn't. But everybody did that, though. I mean, that was just the way it worked. It was real loose, and it played it real loose in the old West. And that's why I think you got a lot of paranormal activity attributed to it, because it really was wild, but not wild in the way we think of it in Hollywood. It was just like there was no set of rules that much. Um, they had laws, but very rarely did they enforce those laws to the very letter of it, unless gunplay happened. Gunplay was a more serious matter, and having been shot at, I know how that can be. When somebody's shooting at you, that's a very serious situation there. Okay, um, so I can understand how that would be. What's your spin on it? What do you think about it?
Well, obviously, they call it the Wild West for a reason. I mean, not only
Yeah.
because of the landscape and the frontier, but also because of characters that were out there. There wasn't any law, and most of them came there, like Wyatt Earp, and they end up being the sheriffs or the local marshals or whatever. And so there's always going to be confrontation in them places. And they say today, you go by the OK Corral, and I think you were talking about it, you can hear gunshots, or you might see a paranormal activity, where you might even see a ghost, and they say it, especially at the OK Corral, you can hear the gunshots, and once in a while you can get a glimpse of a ghost, pointing a gun at you. But as soon as you hear the shot, then they disappear. Now, I'm just wondering
Mm-hmm.
myself, do they disappear because they were shot themselves, and then they disappeared just like they did it today? They lost their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I was talking about earlier, residual haunting, which is like a tape playing over and over again. It's like a memory. I call it a haunting memory. That's what it is. It's sort of like a memory, and you can catch it sometimes. It's almost as if you're in the right place at the right time. You get a glimpse of it. And I say that every now and then there are gunshots heard there, because you got to think about, I think 3 men actually left this world from that area um, when they were shot, very under traumatic reasons that would definitely leave some kind of residual behind. There's also talk of misty figures being seen, sort of, not full-bodied apparitions, but sort of misty-looking kind of thing. So you get in places like that, where, especially, and I think one of the most haunted areas there is the Birdcage Saloon. The Birdcage, which was really called the Birdcage because it was a house of ill repute. By the way, it was a bordello, and the reason it was called a birdcage is because the women were called birds. That was sort of slang term for prostitutes. Um, and the cages were the little rooms up in the top, the little rooms that they did their business in, and they called them cages, bird cages. That's where it got its name. But there was a lot of gambling went on down in the bottom part, which where the saloon was, the bottom floor. And they say to this day you can see some really freaky stuff. And I've always wanted to spend the night in the bird cage and just see what I could see. But they say some really strange things go on there. And here's one other thing that I heard about. That on this one of the playing card tables down there, the cards are laid out, and one of just for for display purposes, poker chips and the cards laying out, just like the gamblers would have left it. And it said that one of the hands is showing, and it's the dead man's hand. You've heard of that, the dead man's
Right.
hand, which is what
Aces and eights.
Bill Hickok was supposedly holding when he was killed. And they say that the weird thing was that usually they laid up so the display, and they come in the morning, just about every morning they're turned over. They're turned face down, which is kind of freaky. Or somebody trying to tell you something there or what, I don't like that hand, but no. Anyway, that's I think it's aces and eights is the dead man's hand is called. I
Right.
think it's what he was holding when he was shot in the back of the head. But by the way, while Bill Hickok was getting kind of old, and he had eye problems. You don't hear about this that much. I think he had glaucoma, and
Oh,
his eyes were beginning to fail him. So he was one of the most deadliest pistoliers, as they call them. They didn't call them gunslingers back then; they call them pistoliers. And he was one of the most deadly of all. But he only had, I think, a handful of shootouts. He got more of a reputation, just like Doc Holliday, from a lot of things they didn't really do. Just got told about. Um, and when the Penny Dreadfuls came out about him, the little books that they put out, the little books,
right.
made more of a reputation for him. I mean, if it made money, and so they would embellish it quite a bit. But his eyesight was failing him, so eventually somebody would have gotten him, or because it was you wanted bragging rights, going, hey, I killed Bill Hickok, I shot him, and all that. It was what that guy did. They hung him later on, by the way, but not for that. Another thing, I think he shot somebody else or something. They hung him, but he shot him from behind, which is very cowardly. That's just something you didn't do in the old west. You didn't shoot anybody in the back.
Right.
Um, and that really, when you look at it that way, Gerald, if you found that you had a victim shot in the back, they had to question you because was the guy, facing you or running from you or what? You had no reason to shoot him in the back. There was now in the front might have been self-defense, but in the back was more cowardly, and so you had to look at somebody twice when you shot somebody. I don't know how he got away with that, or it might have had, he might have been the nephew of the judge or something. I don't know. But he got away with it. But I think they got him for another infatuation later on. Did he something that he did? Got him hung. He was the one, kind of like the one that shot Jesse James. He shot him in the back.
Right.
And the story is with Jesse James, and I'm gonna tell you about him in a minute. The story about Jesse James, he always wore his guns because he didn't trust anybody. And Robert Ford was his friend. Robert Ford and two other guys were there that day. They came to see Jesse, and he said that he was looking at the picture and said, that picture's crooked. And he got up and he took his guns off and laid them down and got on a stool to reach the picture. And when he did, that's when Robert Ford took out his gun and shot him in the back.
Yep.
So let that be a lesson. Keep your guns on. Keep your guns on. Don't turn your back on the wrong people, okay? But according to paranormal legend, Jesse James still rides. He's seen his ghost is supposedly seen in several places in the Old West, especially in Missouri. I think he's seen it out of the line. And I think somebody not long ago actually found one of the, shall we say, gold deposits of Jesse James by following some clues. And so he's sort of amateur archaeologist, but he followed some clues and actually found, I think, a couple of mason jars with some old coins in it, which probably were left there sort of as an emergency thing by Jesse James. But Jesse James has a lot of ghost stories connected to him, especially at the old James house. There's supposedly where his ghost is seen a lot as well. Um, this family, he was in the Confederate Army, one of the Raiders, Quantrell's Raiders, I believe is what he was. And so his family paid a kind of a bad price for the Civil War because some of them were hung, some of them were killed, they were burned out, I think, and his mother got hurt real bad and all that. So he had a vendetta, especially against Northern people. Uh, Jesse James did. So he was still, in some really odd way, still fighting the Civil War, even long after it was over. But he made money off of it too. He made a lot. He didn't make a whole lot of money, but he made enough to get by with. But his brother Frank James and actually went straight after Jesse died and became a preacher. A lot of people don't know that, but Frank James became a preacher and talked about the evils of bank robbing and stuff like that. A very fascinating thing. But I would like to go to a lot of these old places and check them out, especially the grave sites, like Boot Hill and all that. That's very interesting. One of my favorite tombstones on Boot Hill is here lies Les Moore, shot to death with a 44. No Les, no more.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good one.
Yeah, you got Fred White, that was friends with all those people, on both sides, and he ended up getting shot, by Curly Joe, gut
Mm-hmm.
shot, because he was, if you watch the movie, you know the reference anyway, but it really happened in real life, they got
Oh
gut
yeah.
shot. And they
Yeah.
say he's one of the ghosts there in Tombstone that people see as Fred White, because actually being gut shot, he didn't die right away. He lived in agony for a few days or whatever before he passed. So that
Mm-hmm.
might be why he's haunting the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another death there. Definitely, I think he was shot out in the street, and but he died in a boarding house or wherever it was at. Like you said, after several days. Back in those days, you didn't have the only real true anesthesia you had was a bottle of whiskey. Um, so it was probably an agonizing death, definitely, depending on where you was shot. If it was a gut shot, that could make you last for days before you die. Very bad pain, definitely. Anyway, the thing about Johnny Ringo is very interesting. To this day, we don't know. There, you can find his gravesite. He was buried. Some people contend he actually committed suicide. He actually killed himself, and he was found laying under this tree. Um, a lot of people think that maybe, and like you see in the movie, that Doc Holliday finally had it out with him, and because they had some bad blood between them, and we play for blood, as they say in the movie, and that he might have, done Johnny Ringo in, but he was found days later at that tree. And you can still go to the site where he's supposedly, and the tree is still there where he's buried. Um, I think it's a marker, but it's on private land, so you have to, ask permission to go there to see it. But it
Yeah.
would be, I've always wanted to go there and camp out just to see if there was any residual stuff going on there, and it might tell you what really truly happened. Um, it's a possibility. They say that Johnny Ringo got depressed a lot, so you do have suicide sometimes with a lot of depression like that, unfortunately, and that might be the true case. I don't know, but I don't know. Doc Holliday was still around in the vicinity when that happened, and here's what they would do. They would, if something like that took place, they would immediately ride for the state line because of those state laws back in those days. One state you could get arrested, and the other state you couldn't. It was like going to another country. Um, the state laws were very a lot different now than they are then, than they were then. But um, they say that it was strange. Here's the interesting thing about it: that after Ringo was found, Doc Holliday disappeared and
Oh.
ended up, I think, in Colorado or Arizona, somewhere else. Um, so it makes you wonder, why why did it, kind of convenient that he disappeared like that about along the same time. So I've always wondered. I kind of feel like he might have had out with Johnny Ringo at the end, but they were supposed to be two of the best pistoliers around, and so when you got two of the bad boys on the block, they're going to eventually definitely meet up. But that would be interesting to see. I would love to camp out there and just see what you might see.
Yeah, you got, back then, we had territories a lot of time, depending on what time frame you're talking about. So you didn't have states or any kind of law enforcement, but you had rangers, you had all these vigilantes, that would go out and hunt people down just for the rewards, and a lot of times the criminals would even take off to Mexico, and that was even worse
Oh,
than the Wild West going down into Mexico.
oh yeah, yeah. And another thing is that some of the big cities back then, like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, they had their own vigilantes groups that were going around enforcing the law. I mean, so it depends. Times were very, very dangerous then. I mean, no matter which way you look at it, even if you weren't a gunslinger, you had to be very, very careful how you navigated through the old West. Because if you didn't do it the right way, you'd probably end up getting killed. Especially if you went around running your mouth out, hey, I got me a good silver mine out there and the thing, it'd be a good idea not to tell that, because you might end up with a back shot, definitely getting shot in
Yeah.
the back, and getting claim jumped, as they called it. So you had a lot of so-called ghosts associated with the gold miners and the gold mining towns back then, because gold, the blood and the gold, that's what it was all about. And people would kill just like then, and like it is now. Then, just like then, people would kill you for a few dollars. As
Well,
Clint Eastwood would say, for a few dollars more.
well,
But
that's how you get the legend of the Lost Dutchman, in the superstitious mountains. That he went into
yeah,
town and is carrying his big bag of gold that he had, and that got followed back to his mine, and he was really suspicious of everybody. He took roundabout ways to get back to his camp. Well, wasn't even at his camp when he ended up getting killed.
yeah,
And
yeah.
they say that
Well,
he guards the entrance to his mine now, and people end up missing or dying out there. And
oh yeah, people are still dying out there to this day looking for the lost Dutchman's mine. In the superstitious mountains, are supposedly have a curse on them, put there by the Native Americans, to keep people out, because it was very sacred land to them. And when you violate it, you run the risk of that curse, of running into that. But they say it's a very inhospitable place, full of rattlesnakes. It's dry. There's no water. We take for granted we can walk to the tap and get all the water we want. In certain places in the world, water is a very valuable commodity. And the further out west you go, the more of a value it becomes. There's not that much of a water table out there. That's why it's dry desert land. There's not that much water, and so and that's why you always see um, these cowboys with a canteen of water. You had to have that to survive. If you didn't, you die of dehydration very quickly. I talked to a friend, a guy I knew one time. He stayed out in Palm Springs, and he said that out in Palm Springs, it could be like 112, and it would feel like about 80 because it was so very dry. There's no humidity at all. That's why you have so many fires out there. By the way, the lower the humidity, the more chance of a fire that you have.
right,
Fire getting out of hand, and that will sneak up on you real quick. You get dehydrated quick. You start getting sick and getting dizzy. It could be fatal very quickly. So you got so many things that are so dangerous to you. Not only rattlesnakes and scorpions and spiders and all these other things, Gila monsters, and all these other things to worry about. You got to watch out for the water, losing water and dehydrating. So it's a very inhospitable place. No wonder it's so full of so much death. Like in Death Valley, with the borax traders used to have the big mule trains that went through there. And you cannot exist in a place like that very long unless you're really prepared to do so. And here's another interesting thing that haunts the Old West out in the Death Valley area. Believe it or not, the ghost of Charles Manson is supposedly seen out there now. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what it was, he and his family stayed out in Death Valley in an old bus for a long time. Well, they went back to California, um, to Los Angeles area. But they say that and he may have buried some victims out there in Death Valley. No wonder it's called Death Valley. It seems to attract these kind of stuff. Do it. Um, I would like to check that out too. That would be interesting to find. They say you still see the old bus is still there and all that. And there was family, he and the family lived in it. I think, unless somebody's gotten rid of it lately, it was supposed
You
to
know,
still be there. So,
he used to be in our area during his youth and his teenager, early adult. He was in Peoria,
uh-huh.
Illinois. He had relatives there. I don't know if there's any of
Uh,
them still left in the area or not, but Manson was there, and obviously he was getting in trouble with the law and doing stuff there. And I think it was his grandma had a policeman or a detective or whatever get a hold of him finally and say, "Hey, you need to straighten up or you need to leave." And that's when he made his venture out west.
yeah. He was in a lot of prisons, a lot of jails. He was in and out a lot. He was a very troubled person from the very beginning. Um, that's what his grandmother said about him. Said it was almost as if he was cursed from his birth. He was brought up that way, and I think he was also sexually abused when he was young, and he was definitely done that way in the prisons. So it screwed a lot of his mind was screwed up, I think, in many different ways. And this was one person you look at, you had to say, it's not a wonder they didn't turn out that way, because it seemed like fate had it in store for him to do that. But the interesting thing about Charles Manson, he did commit murders, but not as many as people think he did. He didn't do all the murders. The family, he manipulated people into doing that. He was the instigator for it. He was just as guilty
Right.
of it, of course.
Yeah. He
Under
had
the
his
law, you're just
followers
as
do all the
guilty.
dirty work.
Yeah, they did all the dirty work for him, but he sent them out. But he did murder several people because there are instruments where eyewitnesses saw him kill people. I think one of them was a black man that he was buying dope from or something. He killed him with a sword, and they helped him bury the body or something. And so I think there's still a lot of his victims laying around Los Angeles. And the interesting thing about California, it is still tied to its history of the Old West. It will never be over that because that's part of its history, a main part of its history. And I've always thought when I think of the Old West, I think of Arizona, New Mexico, California. You always think about that, maybe
Right.
Nevada. Nevada, that's where the Ponderosa was supposed to be. Uh, where Ben and his boys lived back in the day. So I always think of that when I think of the Old West. But that also went with Kansas and Missouri, Oklahoma, and all that. That's the West too. So there was a lot of that. It's a big area. And a lot of many territories or states, as we call them now, was territories back then. Um, covers a wide area,
Well,
definitely.
especially thinking about what time period you're talking about. If you go from, the settlers that first started coming across out of St. Louis or wherever you want to start your timeline at, everything past, the Mississippi was the West. It was open
Hmm.
frontier until they started developing it all.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, that whole half of the country was really the West. I mean, that was, and it was divided by the Mississippi River. But a lot of the West kind of spilled over in that area of the Mississippi too. A lot of the old West went into Louisiana and Oklahoma and all up in there because they were the border states of the Mississippi. You had the river boats and the gamblers, so a lot of that went into the old South also. So you had a big connection with that, which is where Texas comes in at. Texas was not only the old South of the West too. Kind of strange to think about it that way, but that's the way it was looked at. So you've got some tremendous history, and like I've always said, Gerald, wherever you have a lot of history, you have a lot of paranormal activity connected with it, no doubt about it. And the more historical the place, the more interesting it gets. I've always wanted to investigate the Alamo, by the way. That would be my number one bucket list if they'd let me. I would love to spend a few weeks there at the Alamo. Um, but definitely, I told I was interviewed in Britain one time. I was talking to this guy on a radio show, and he interviewed me. And I was telling him we were talking about the paranormal and all that. That's what the show was about. And I said, when we talk about history here, we go back 200 years. No wonder England is haunted so badly. You go back 2,000 years on your history. You got a lot more of a head start on us with that. But wherever you have the historical things, like one of the most haunted places I've ever been was Charleston, South Carolina. It's a very old city, has a lot of history to it. There you go, back to the 16th century. I investigated the place down there. I sat on a seawall one night, a 16th century seawall, in the place where Blackbeard hung out, by the way. Blackbeard the pirate
Oh yeah.
in a tavern, yeah. And his ghost was actually supposedly seen there. I had some very freaky experiences. We'll have to talk about that sometime. But anyway, um, wherever history is, that's where I go because I know it's sort of like a magnet for the paranormal.
Did he end up showing up and give you some pieces of eights or anything, or?
Mm. No, I didn't get to excavate anything, unfortunately. I sat in the basement all night under a trap door, sitting on the 16th century seawall. And it was the original seawall that kept the ocean back, so it was sort of part of the beach area would have been too. But as soon as you got off your ship, you went to this tavern, and this tavern is one of the oldest operating businesses still operating in this country in the United States. And it was, I think, founded like in the year 1680 something or something like that. It goes back to the 16th century. But it was one of the hangouts of Blackbeard. As soon as he got off the ship, that's where he and his men went to the tavern. It's called the Tavern, by the way. That's the name of it. But there are a lot of stories of actual pirate ghosts being seen there. And when I investigated it, I said I want to go to the basement. Like I've told you before, if you're ever investigating a place that's supposed to be haunted, you look. Usually, you might want to go to the attic or the basement. The reason being that spirits, when you walk into their domain, they tend to shy away from you. They want to kind of get away from you. So they'll either go up or down and sort of hide from you. That's where you go look for them, where they're hiding. You don't go look for them where they may obviously be. It's a paranormal trick. But anyway,
Right.
I told him, I said, you don't. He had a, he had a two apartments over this thing. You could rent these apartments out. Very nice, right in the city. This is right in the middle of downtown Charleston, right next to the Exchange Building, by the way, which has a lot of history. I would love to investigate the Exchange Building because there's a dungeon in the bottom of it, and part of that seawall that I sat on runs through there. And that's where they imprisoned the pirates. You had a lot of sails down there, and real interesting history. But anyway, he had some apartments over this, And I talked to the people that were in those boats. They had all kinds of paranormal activity in those apartments. And so I said, oh, now I went and asked, do you have a basement? Oh, yeah, I got a basement. He takes me over there, and this, honest to God, looks like something out of a horror movie, okay? He's got a trap door in the floor, a big old
Oh
trap
my.
door with a big iron circle, ring on it. He pulled that thing up and said, you go down the steps, And so you're down and you're up under the street down here in this basement, and there's like two big tunnels, and they run the runs under the street, and of course there's some electrical outlet down there. That's where the main breaker box and all that is. But there's a piece of the seawall. That's where I sat all night on the seawall, and I had some freaky stuff happen, but could not capture any of it on video. Like I
Yeah.
said, we were talking about your Skywatch. You got to have the right kind of stuff to get this, But I had some light, like movements, almost sounded like fireflies, almost lightning bugs moving in the dark. I could never capture them. But I had a very interesting thing happen while I was down there. I felt I could hear something rustling like a little bit, and all of a sudden I had just this feeling. And I'm not psychic, okay? I don't ever claim to be psychic, but it was very odd how this happened. That it was like that there was a female presence there of a woman, like a woman, had walked up to me or something. And I didn't smell any perfume or anything, but I just had that feeling. And then all of a sudden, like somebody touched me on the cheek, just like it would do this, just like this, like you would do somebody, rub somebody's face like that. I felt that. So after the investigation, I went to the owner. I said, look, I want to ask you a question. I didn't tell him what happened to me. I want to ask you a question. I said, you know, uh, did a woman die in here? Do you know of any death of a woman that may have died in here? He said, no, but he said, but where you was sitting last night, there was a serial killer in Charleston back in the 1890s that killed several prostitutes. And it happened in the wintertime, and they couldn't, back in those days, they didn't have backhoes and stuff. They couldn't dig the graves, the ground was froze. And they had to store them in that basement till spring.
Wow.
And so that was the connection, kind of light bulb moment. I felt a woman's presence, and that is where they kept the women's bodies. uh, sure, maybe that's why those lights were there, lingering there. That presence was still there. Very interesting. I'll tell you some more about it sometime, but it was a very, very interesting investigation.
We talk about, the old West and, and the gunfighters and the cowboys and all that, but there was a lot of saloon gals that would get murdered or killed, and there's stories of them also haunting the old West.
Oh, yeah. Well, there was a lot of instances where men would get drunk and kill some of these prostitutes. That was a risk they ran in their business, either getting cut up or stabbed or shot. If you made the man mad or whatever, you asked for more money than you agreed on, or whatever the case might have been, or they just get drunk. And here's another thing: we think a lot about alcohol, and of course that was a prevalent drug, and that alcohol is nothing but a liquid drug. That's what it is. But there was a lot. Almost every old West mining town, everything had an opium den.
Right.
There was a lot of opium going on. Oh yeah. But now opium basically made you sleepy. That's why they call dens. You had to lay down on a cot and sleep when you had your trip. Um, but sometimes it would do people differently. Sometimes it make them wild, and they go out. You see that I think in the movie Tombstone, where Curly Bill goes out and shoots the town up. That's before he shot the White Sheriff White.
Right.
The marshal. He shot him after he got high on opium. And you combine opium and whiskey, and you got a really tight situation there. And so that happened a lot. So there were a lot of prostitutes that were murdered, definitely. And here's another thing. We're talking about almost a way of organized crime, basically. There was sort of a loose mafia type thing in the old West. If you ran a brothel, and you did, you're like cheating your owner out of the money that you were making for him. They could get rid of you that way too. It was a bad thing, and that was worse almost than stealing a horse. Uh, that'd get you hung too.
Well,
But
that's weird that you brought that up, because there's the story of the headless horseman out west, where there's an apparition of a guy without a head on riding on a horse out in the deserts that people see still.
Supposedly, I think he might have been attacked by Native Americans or something. Somehow or another, they got these heads shut off, blown off, or whatever. That his ghost is supposedly seen, I think, in a canyon a lot, riding through this canyon area with this canyon, a big canyon.
I think he was a horse thief, and they decapitated him to put a lesson out, and they strapped him to his horse and sent him out in the desert. And the Indians do have a legend out there of a headless horseman riding.
Yeah, you have a lot of old legends like that about the Phantom Riders, and of course, the most famous one of all, the Ghost Riders. The song, the Ghost Riders.
Yep.
And actually, I did some research on that, and I think it was inspired by a European legend of the Wild Hunt. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Wild Hunt. If you haven't ever done any research on it, it's fascinating research. But the Wild Hunt is supposed to, I talk about it in my book, The Road Unseen. It's supposed to happen, I think, during the winter time of the year, around Christmas, New Year's, when the god Odin, the Viking god Odin, would ride with his wild hunt over the land with the winds of winter. And if you were caught out, he'd sweep you up, and you'd have to ride forever with the wild hunt. This sounds very much like the Ghost Riders, of the Old West.
Yeah.
So there is a connection, definitely. But you have a lot of what we call individual rides. I think there's one haunting that's actually in Texas, where people have heard and seen a column of Confederate soldiers that still ride through this town occasionally. So they are ghost riders too, you might say. They're still going to a battle or coming from one, whatever the case. So you have a lot of connections with the Civil War and the Old West soldiers and stuff that went on out there. You see a lot of that alluded to in the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with Clint Eastwood. They had a lot of Civil War stuff that went on in Texas, Oklahoma, and places like that. So that's another connection to a lot of these hauntings and stuff. The battlefields. And then you also of course, had areas of battles with Native Americans and like Apache wells and places like that that's supposed to still be haunted. And of course, one of the most famous areas is the Custer Battlefield, the Little Bighorn. Well, to this day, they say you can still hear the war cries and gunshots on lonely nights out there. I've heard a lot of stories about it, and actually see apparitions of Native Americans and cavalry soldiers still fighting that battle that's now eternal.
Right.
It's a very traumatic place. A lot of people died in a very bad way. You're bound to have some kind of ghost activity.
The weird thing is, you're talking about the Civil War. Right before that, there's ghost camels, and you wouldn't think of the U.S. having camels, but they imported camels to try to use them to deliver stuff across the deserts, in the open area out there in the West. And when the Civil War came up, they ended up not knowing what to do with all these camels, And they
Turn them
either
loose.
killed them or they sent them out in the desert to wander, and take care of themselves. And that's when you get all these ghost stories about camels or these. I think the one
That's
was
a,
called Red Hair or Red something.
yeah, I've heard of that one. Yeah, and what it was, unfortunately, the world was set up more for horses than anything else, and they tried to integrate that with the camels, and it just didn't work out. It was just more of a trouble to take care of the camels, and it wouldn't be just regular horses, and that's what happened with that. But to this day, some people report seeing these ghosts of camels out there in the desert, and some people have speculated there may actually still be some camels out there that they're still bred and all that because they turned a large amount of them loose out there.
Or
But
there's a big
some of these
area out there.
yeah, some of these are supposed to be ghost animals, you know.
Then you got like when we were talking about the miners and stuff, when the gold rush was over, they all had dogs, and companions and stuff, and they ended up leaving them, and the prospector died or everybody moved on. They kind of left their dogs there, some of them. And so you have these, they call it, what was it, the Hell Dogs of El Dorado or something is the
Yeah,
story.
yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah, it's interesting that those are supposed to be ghost dogs. And they say there may actually be some of them still existing in real time, real life. That are there's an interesting thing. There is a hypothesis that there is a breed of dogs in this country that was left over from colonial times, and they're still breeding out there. And you catch a glimpse every once in a while of them, and they have a strange look to them. I think there's some that actually have been seen in this state where I'm at, South Carolina, that are
Oh,
supposed to be leftovers from colonial times. They're not wild. They're sort of semi-wild, like they shy away from people, but yet they're not completely like a pack of wild dogs. You know what I'm saying?
right.
But there is talk of that, and it's very interesting that as time goes on, you might have what you would call residual animals left behind, or even the ghost of animals. Animals have a spirit. Why would they not have a ghost? Like you have that total lot about in England and all that old Black Shuck and all these ghost dogs you hear about, like the Hound of the Baskervilles and all that. Uh, so you have that unique thing about animals, and that's why even some of these so-called ghosts that we were talking about are seen. They always have the ghost horse with them. Ever notice that?
You got Native American stories and also, the Western stories of horses, like the white horse, the spirit horse that will show up,
Mm.
and they'll see him on a bluff or running out in the distance, and it'll be pure white horse, but then it disappears.
hmm Well, the horses were brought here. Horses were not here. Of course, I think if you go back millions of years,
Well,
the
the
ancestors of the
conquistadors
horse
brought them, right?
were here. But yeah, the conquistadors brought the horses in, and the Native Americans had no words for the name for a horse, so they called him a big dog. They had no word in their language for it. That's where you get the name dog soldiers at, by the way. Uh, they were horse soldiers, but they called them dog soldiers because they had no name for a horse. They didn't call them horses. They called them dogs, big dogs. Um, so anyway, it's interesting how much of their culture, how much they embraced the horse, and became so integral and important part to their culture. It's fascinating, and to know that before then they had to walk. That was it. You didn't have nothing else to ride. That was it. Um, but there are stories. Now, I don't know how far back this goes of some Native Americans actually riding deer, being able to capture wild
Oh,
deer and use them. Yeah, that and that's not that far fetched because that happened in Lapland in Norway. People
Right.
actually domesticated deer to pull sleighs, and they ride them like horses too. By the way, um, so it's not that far fetched. They might have had something like that. But anyway, I find it fascinating how much their culture embraced something from the outside world, you might say, for them, and it became so important. Just like the buffalo was so important. And there are stories of ghost herds of buffalo that were seen, supposedly, and heard. But the buffalo was a very integral part, especially for the Plains Indians, of their lives. They used it, and they didn't waste one bit of that buffalo. They used every bit of the buffalo that they killed, even boiling his hooves down and everything for glue and stuff. It's amazing what
Well,
these people could do.
wasn't there a story of the great white buffalo with was it Wild Bill Hickok and was it Sitting Bull, one of the Native Americans? They both had kind of the same tie with the
Yeah.
great white buffalo.
Well, the spirit buffalo, the great white buffalo, is supposed to be a symbol for the Plains Indians of their returning glory of their nation. And when Sitting Bull, after the Battle of Little Bighorn and all that, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse was killed. He was actually assassinated by some other American Indians. Um, Sitting Bull actually was not the instigator of it. He kind of cautioned them against it, but that's when they began the ghost dances. And the ghost dance were ceremonies that was supposed to bring back the spirits of the ancestors, and to take the
Oh,
land back, that way. And it became almost, it was a very sort of a religious kind of a thing, definitely a religious frenzy about it. And they would work themselves up to great extent, and the authorities didn't like that. They said, "Oh, you need to come," and they blamed Sitting Bull for it, but it wasn't really him that did it. He didn't start it. He cautioned the people against doing. Don't do that because you're going to make matters worse for us. We're stuck here on the reservation. You just make it worse for us. And they wouldn't listen to him. And so the zealots of this religion laid the groundwork for some pretty bad things to happen. And I think one of them was the Wounded Knee, the
right.
incident of Wounded Knee. And they say, of course, it is a very haunted location to this day because so many, especially women and children, died there, murdered, actually. It wasn't a battle. They were just systematically murdered by the remnants of the Seventh Cavalry, by the way. So it was sort of a revenge thing, okay? Um, and of course, I think also on the day that Lincoln was inaugurated, he had, I think, so many Native Americans hung um, out there. So you look, I mean, the old West is drenched in blood. No matter which way you look at it, very bad stuff happened. Murders, killings, massacres. Um, the
You know,
list goes on and on.
you talk about Lincoln's death. You know, there's still the story of the ghost train of his. You know,
Oh,
because
yeah.
they took Lincoln across the country. You know, on the train. So there's the ghost train that has
Especially
Lincoln's.
in Illinois too, especially
You
in
have
Illinois.
Lincoln's body. You know, on a train on a ghost train, supposedly rolling through.
I
You know, also
don't
the
know if you
Native
know
American.
this or not. Of course, Lincoln is a very famous ghost. He's seen a lot in the White House. It's a ghost train, and they say you can still hear the whistle of the what it was, the ghost train. Whenever it started, the original train, the funeral train, when it would approach the city, would blow its horn and let people know it was coming in. You know, and they say there's certain areas like in Illinois you can still hear that noise, that horn, blowing sometimes on the anniversary of when it came in. It was a big thing. People, of course, back in those days, uh, they had a fascination with death. I think almost, because
Right.
it was so prevalent. It was part of life. It's like that prayer. That prayer goes, in the midst of life, we are in death. You know, it's constantly with us. Um, anyway, yeah, they say you can still hear that sound. I'm gonna tell you something fascinating about Lincoln. I don't know if you know this or not, but there was a plot to steal his body.
Yes.
They actually were getting. They actually almost. They broke into the first tomb he was in. They almost. So they actually. Here's a weird part about it. They actually removed his body and hid it for like a year till they could build the tomb it's in now. That's what they had to build it. And it ended up in this, I forget who it was, basement. He had Abraham Lincoln's body in his basement for like a whole year. And they say he was embalmed so good that they still, when they opened the casket, he still looked the same. I mean, he was deteriorating, but not, like you would think after a year, especially. But he actually hid his body in his basement for a year. I think he was a war secretary or something like that. I forget who it was now. And so they could put him in the tomb where he is now. And he lies under, I think, like 12 feet of concrete. So they said nobody will ever steal this body, okay? But
Yeah.
they almost did. They broke into, and I think were scared off by a guard or something. They actually were almost very close to stealing Abraham Lincoln's body. They would have held it for ransom, by the way. That's what it was all about, the money. But it's a fascinating thing. I want
Yeah.
to talk about, what he says on Shakespeare's tomb. He's got a little epitaph on there, and it says, blessed be he who, venerates these bones, but cursed be he who touches my bones. There's a curse on them. To mess with somebody's bones was a bad thing. It was just a desecration, that people didn't want to mess with. But there are, and we'll talk about that. This will make a good show one day. There are professional grave robbers, people who will steal bones and stuff for you if you're a collector of things like that.
Right.
They will actually go and get someone's famous skull or something for you. And according part of the legends of the Old West say that Geronimo's skull was stolen from his grave and resides in, I think, Washington, somewhere where where that college is, with Skull and Bones that supposedly
Oh,
the Bush family's linked to. That
yeah.
skull is supposed to be Geronimo's skull, by the way. So
It's
that's an
kind of weird.
interesting.
It's kind of weird that, we're talking about the Old West, but we talked about Abraham Lincoln. But, the White House is very haunted. You have all the presidents,
Uh,
you got Mary Todd, you got Abraham Lincoln, you got their children that died, during his time in presidency. So there's a lot of going ons in the White House.
well, Mary Todd Lincoln was fascinated with the paranormal and spiritualism. She had seances in the White House and made Abraham Lincoln attended some of them. I think she kind of got him interested in the paranormal to a certain extent. We actually had a vision of his own death. He actually saw his own funeral and where they had his body. So you got some very strange stories connected to the White House, which was there when the days of the Old West was down. Definitely, it's been there a long time. You got some connections with that, and one of the connections to the Old West would definitely be Teddy Roosevelt,
Right.
who was connected with the White House, by the way. That way. He was a real frontiersman, Teddy Roosevelt. Oh, he's one of my favorite presidents. I liked him. He was a real cool guy. He was a real man's man.
Yeah, he was involved in I don't know necessarily paranormal, but evidently he had in his books that he wrote or the stories were written about him anyway about Bigfoot or some kind of big creature that he encountered while he was out there in the West roaming
Mm-hmm.
around.
Well, he also told the story and I've read it, an account of I think some explorers that were murdered supposedly by Bigfoot. One of them was, I think, killed, and the count was messed up by him or something. Um, I think it was like it's supposed to be somewhere in the West. I don't know exactly where at it was. I can't remember now. But anyway, it might have been in Washington, Oregon, somewhere like that out in the West. But that's a fascinating story. If you ever get a chance to read that account, it's online. It's interesting. But he spent a lot of time in the old West. He was one of the Rough Riders. He was the Rough
Right.
Rider. Mhm.
And also, that if you've ever watched the series Curse of Oak Island, there's stories about in his early times that he was out there and involved in even that, and there's ghost
Oh,
stories of the Curse of Oak Island and that whole
yeah.
story. And Teddy Roosevelt was involved in that even.
Oh yeah, but when Teddy Roosevelt was assembling the Rough Riders for the Spanish American War, uh, ride up San Juan Hill, he asked. He said, "I want some cowboys in here. Go get me some cowboys." He wanted some men from the West because he knew them. He said, "I want some real men, to back me up." I thought it was very interesting that he even got his glasses shot off to the Battle of San Juan Hill. Um, he was the one on horseback, and he made a very good target, by the way, because all the rest of them were not on horses. Most of them were. He was on horseback, and my favorite part of it was he was hollering at them, get on up there, come on, let's go. Are you a bunch of cowards? Follow me, don't be cowards, follow me. And when they finally took San Juan Hill, he got up there, and they were, the ones that were left alive. A lot of them died trying to take that hill. He told him, he said, I want to apologize to every one of you today. There are no cowards here.
Yep.
He was quite an interesting character.
He was definitely very charismatic and quite a leader. And he didn't just sit there and tell them to do something. He did it with them, or was like you said, was in the front.
Yeah, yeah. He made himself a target. And like I said, he got his glasses shot off. That's pretty close. That was sort of the last run of the old West, San Juan Hill, because there were so many people from the West there and from the South, from the Confederacy, the old Confederacy. I think one of the captains was a retired Confederate general or a colonel or something like that. Um, so you had the last remnants of the old West and the old South involved, and then a lot of them, of course, were Northerners, Yankees. Were in it
Right.
too. Everybody. It was a real hodgepodge of the whole thing, and that's what I find so fascinating about that was it was everybody in that thing was represented. Even there were Native Americans that were part of it, of the Rough Riders. A fascinating story. But I've often wondered, has anyone ever investigated San Juan Hill? That would be interesting to find out because a lot of people died on that very dark and bloody ground. That's what the Native Americans used to call Kentucky, the dark and bloody ground, because it fought over so much.
Yeah,
Definitely.
any place that you have stuff like that, you always talk about the Civil War, and the ghosts on the battlefield. Well, there's got to be everywhere else in the U.S. that you had battles, whether it was the settlers and the Indians or the government and the Indians, the cavalry and the Indians. There's got to be other areas that this, like you talked about, Little Bighorn and Wounded
Uh-huh.
Knee and all. There's all these battles that have to have some kind of residue
Oh
hauntings
yeah.
and
I don't see how you couldn't have it. I mean, it's so prevalent. And right not too far from where I live, there was a small Confederate skirmish, Confederate thing. And actually, I've had a ghost story from that where a lady, and I know this lady well. She's a very reliable, person. Said that one day she was driving through the fog. She was a school teacher going to school, and she passed this guy walking, and he was kind of on the side of the road, and he said he had gray on, and he was dragging a rifle, and was walking down the road, and said she passed him, and said, Well, that's the weirdest thing, because he looked like he didn't belong there. You know, it was just that
Right.
feeling that you see something that that's just not right. And she went on down the road a little ways, and the fog wasn't that thick. It wasn't a real thick fog. It was some real misty like. And she said, she turned back around and said, somebody was in trouble or hurt or something. She didn't know what. So she turned around, went back, couldn't see him. He was gone. And she said, it was just that very quick. He was gone. There was nowhere he could have went
Right.
to hide. And said, and suddenly occurred to her she was right next to that battlefield where I think this little battle took place, and that might have been a residual of somebody, of a ghost that was leaving there, at that time, a residual of that. That's what I told her. It sounded like very much like a residual haunting because there was no interaction between them. He didn't, he just like she wasn't there to him and all that. She just got a glimpse of him. So you have that. A lot of people talk about that at Gettysburg and these places, these battles. You're still seeing these. Unfortunately, these soldiers are still fighting those battles in the other world in a way. But I think it's a lot. It's sort of a time slip thing. That's what I think it is. I think it's you getting a glimpse through time.
Right. Yeah, there has to be, all across the U.S., especially as this was a developing nation, and you were talking about miners being killed, the Alamo. I mean, is there a lot of stories in the Alamo with Jim Bowie and Sam Houston and Davy Crockett? Is there any ghost stories with them still being around? I mean,
Oh,
that was a
definitely.
very traumatic event.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Like I said, that's on my bucket list. Definitely top one. I would love to investigate the Alamo. I would spend a couple of weeks there if they'd let me. That's just to get the feel of the place. But when you go to the Alamo, you're really shocked to find all these big buildings around it, and it's just a little place in the middle of a big city. But I have actually seen some of the one of the oldest photographs of the Alamo. That's before the city growed up around it. It is a eerie looking place. Definitely, you could, and this photograph was taken like 20 years after the battle or something like that. It was still there, and they were using it though um, for cattle, holding pens for cattle and stuff. But and it has changed slightly over time. But right next to it, there was a bigger building, and all that was torn down and destroyed. Unfortunately, a lot of history was destroyed, and just that little small section of that building left, but still it'd be worth investigating, definitely. But there are stories told of apparitions seen walking the sidewalks around there of to this day that may be the residual of that battle. And some of the buildings nearby, I think there's a garage nearby where they say they have seen like Mexican soldiers from the from the Alamo, the soldiers, the spirits of those. And here's an interesting thought, Gerald. They went back and traced where the Mexican army marched to the Alamo, and it was told, I think, in somebody's diary that they ran into a freak snowstorm. You wouldn't believe
Oh,
this or not. A freak snowstorm, and they had to divert or something. And so they traced this with satellite, GPS and all this, and actually found where they marched and found actual Mexican army buttons.
really?
And didn't have to dig very deep. I mean, it was just, and they're still left over all these many years later. Fascinating. Our history is still with us. And, that's why it's so very important that we preserve that history. It's part of us. It's part of what makes us us. And for us to tear down statues and try to destroy that history is a terrible thing.
Right.
We need to preserve our history, the good and the bad of it, because it's what we were, it's what we are, and what we could be in the future if we don't take the lessons of history to heart. You know?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all these memorials and statues, whether it is a good thing for your side or your history, it could be something bad for somebody else, but you need to learn from that. Like you were talking about, you need to take that history and learn so you don't either repeat it or
Yeah,
you learn on what good aspects of the history it was.
exactly. It's very important that we not do away with our records of these things. And that's why I tell everybody, girl. It's like that old saying: one day we will all be stories. Okay, that somebody hopefully will tell somewhere. One day we'll all be stories, even if they're just stories amongst our own kin people, and we're not well known. But we all will be stories one day. We all will be history. Okay, and that's why it's so important to preserve it. Um, and here's one other thing I always tell people: tell your story. Whatever happened to you, write it down. Leave some kind of record behind because no story should ever be lost to history. That's how important all this stuff is. I love diaries and stuff like that because it's like a time machine. Old photographs are time machines for us to see what it was like. To me, that's fascinating stuff. Um, I was looking the other day. It's only been like 200 years or something since the first photograph was actually made. Think about that. Only 200, not even 200 years of our history before that was done. So look how much was lost, unfortunately. I read a science fiction story one time where this guy actually had a time machine and he went back and he said into time and he took pictures of famous people, but nobody would believe him. No, that's fake. he had the real pictures of them, but nobody would believe it. That's fake. But I also read another time story. I love time travel stories about where a guy went back and he said he was going to make a fortune stealing stuff. And he went back to the Civil War and stole stuff off the battlefield, like guns and stuff, and brought them back and tried to sell them, and nobody would buy them. Said, they look too new. You know, that's a fake. They're new, and so he didn't figure out he shouldn't have that patina of time to them. That's what was wrong. So you got to be careful. Time and history are very important things, and I think when they entwine with the paranormal like that, and like the tales of the old west that are still alive, the ghost stories keep it alive for us to a certain extent. And I've done a lot of presentations at schools, and I've had a lot of kids. Oh, the kids love ghost stories.
Right.
And I've had a lot of kids at the end. They would come up to me and say, "Mr. Carroll, do you believe in ghosts?" So I didn't want to scare them or anything. So I said, "Well, let me say this: I believe in ghost stories." Okay. So I still stand by that statement. I believe in ghost stories because they point us to things that are very, very important. Folklore and all this other stuff are part of our culture. They're part of us. And it's a stupid thing to ignore them, a stupid thing to push them aside and not look at them for what they're worth and enjoy them and understand them for what they are. And the importance of them are tantamount. But that's what makes the paranormal paranormal. Love the normal is the things of olden times and things that are still there, the residual hauntings, the actual true hauntings, or whatever may be going on. That's a very important link to the past, definitely.
Right. And that's the thing, about the Native Americans. They keep their oral history going, from generation to generation. And we've kind of lost that, of
Mm.
course the settlers, the Europeans, us, we have our histories, but we don't have the oral history or the spiritual side necessarily like the Native Americans have kept alive. And there's
We
a
did.
lot of
We did once, Cheryl. People used to sit around the campfires or the fireplaces and tell these stories. So every generation would pass it along, but they don't do that anymore. No,
right.
we've lost that, and we've lost that. That's a sad thing, really, that we don't keep it alive like that anymore. That's why I tell people, write that down, write it down, It's very important that you make a record. I don't care if you record it or whatever, however you do it. It's very, very important that you record that.
Yeah, just think of all those stories that we'll never hear that could have been amazing or great stories that, generations told, like you said, around the fireplaces or campfires, and there's no written history of it or even passed down orally.
That's sad, really, to think how much we've lost. What a great treasure we've lost, unfortunately. That's why we should treasure what we do have and preserve it. Definitely. Well,
Yep.
it's been we've killed about an hour and a half here, sir. So I think it's
All
about
right.
time to cash our chips in, as they say in the old West.
All right. We've had quite a few people show up in chat. We didn't really have very many questions or anything, but they were pretty active talking amongst themselves. And we thank all you guys for showing up. And William definitely appreciates it, even though he couldn't be here today. He was taking care of some family business, something, with his health and stuff that he really needed to get done. And me and Dennis appreciate you tuning in and listening to us ramble on today. And you have anything you want to say, Dennis?
Well, I'll just say, we'll be here tomorrow in the morning at 10 o'clock on the Sunday Paranormal Morning Brew, hopefully, and we'll see what else we'll see what we can come up with tomorrow. Yeah.
Yep, and William will be back with us tomorrow, and we'll continue the discussion on whatever William comes up with. I don't know if he's really said anything about tomorrow, but I'm sure we'll come up with something.
Yep, sounds good. Well, until then, like and share us out, artists or whatever. And we need to get as many subscribers going as we can to get out there and tell everybody where we're at. Tell them that we're having some really good discussions here. You might want to listen in and share if you care. That's our motto.
That's right. Give us some likes and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any shows, and tune in to all of William's shows and Dennis's shows. They have Becoming Monsters and what other shows? You guys rotate that, right? Between Becoming Monsters and midnight something.
And you got Midnight Monsters, and then you got In the Red Rabbit Hole. We're gonna have to get a roster of all this stuff.
Yeah, we're gonna have to write it down so we can read it off for everybody.
Yeah,
then
definitely.
you can tune into our channel, and we have Midwest Night Watchers, and we have Piercing the Veil on Sundays at 6 p.m. And then after that, Dennis, you have your show on Sunday nights.
Yeah, Sunday night at 9. That's Demonology Today. And who knows what else we'll come up with.
So on that note, people, we'll say adieu and say goodbye and see you tomorrow morning.
Have a great Saturday. Until next time.